Most people don't lose fat adaptation because they stop eating low carb. They lose it because they slowly reintroduce the same stress signals that blocked it in the first place. You can be doing keto perfectly and still slide backward without realizing it. Not because you failed, but because fat adaptation is conditional, not permanent. In this video, I'll show you how fat adaptation actually breaks down over time, the subtle mistakes that quietly undo it, and how to protect it long-term without going extreme, restrictive, or obsessive. If you've worked hard to become fat adapted, this is the video that helps you keep it. Why fat adaptation is easy to lose. Fat adaptation is often treated as an achievement, something you reach, check off, and then keep indefinitely as long as carbohydrates stay low. In reality, fat adaptation is not a permanent state that is locked in by willpower or dietary discipline. It is a conditional state that depends on ongoing signals of stability. When those signals change, the body adapts again, often more quickly than people expect. The most important misunderstanding is believing that fat adaptation is maintained by effort. It is not. It is maintained by context. The body does not burn fat because you are disciplined. It burns fat because it perceives that doing so is safe, reliable, and efficient. That perception is shaped primarily by nervous system input, sleep quality, stress load, recovery, and predictability, not by motivation. This is why fat adaptation can unravel quickly under stress. From a biological perspective, stress signals always override dietary intent. Poor sleep, psychological pressure, excessive training, undereating, or chronic stimulation all signal instability. When instability is detected, the body does not stay the course out of loyalty to your diet. It reverts to faster, more controllable fuel strategies, namely glucose and stress hormone-driven energy production. This happens even if carbohydrates remain low. Importantly, this reversion is not dramatic. There is rarely a clear moment where fat adaptation is lost. Instead, small changes accumulate. Energy becomes less stable. Hunger urgency increases slightly. Stress tolerance declines. Food timing feels more important again. These shifts are subtle enough that many people miss them until performance drops, cravings rise, or fat loss stalls. By then, the body has already shifted away from fat-based efficiency. Another reason fat adaptation is easy to lose is that the body prioritizes survival over efficiency. Fat burning is an efficient, long-term strategy, but it requires confidence in energy availability. Under stress, the body values responsiveness over efficiency. It would rather rely on glucose and cortisol than risk slow fuel access when demands feel unpredictable. This is not a flaw in metabolism. It is an adaptive safety mechanism. Crucially, fat adaptation is maintained, not achieved once. Just as insulin sensitivity can improve or worsen based on lifestyle inputs, fat adaptation exists on a spectrum. It deepens when stability is reinforced and erodes when stress accumulates. There is no finish line where adaptation becomes immune to context. This is why people can do keto perfectly and still slide backward. The diet may remain consistent, but the environment the metabolism is responding to has changed. More pressure, less sleep, higher expectations, less recovery. The body responds accordingly. Understanding this reframes fat adaptation entirely. Losing adaptation is not a personal failure or a lack of discipline. It is a signal that the conditions supporting it are no longer present. And that also means it can be protected, not by trying harder, but by stabilizing the signals that allow fat burning to remain safe long-term.
One of the most damaging myths around fat adaptation is the idea that once you achieve it, you are set for life. That fat adaptation is something you unlock, after which your metabolism permanently prefers fat as fuel as long as you keep carbohydrates low. This belief is appealing, but biologically inaccurate. Fat adaptation is not a permanent metabolic upgrade. It is a state that must be continuously supported. The body does not remember fat adaptation out of loyalty to past effort. It responds only to current signals. If those signals change, metabolism adapts again. The reason this myth persists is that fat adaptation often feels stable once it is established. Energy is smoother, hunger is calmer, food timing feels flexible. Because these benefits can last for weeks or months, people assume they are locked in. But what they are actually experiencing is an environment that is still supportive. When that environment slowly degrades, the shift back out of fat adaptation happens just as quietly. The nervous system is the deciding factor over time. Fat adaptation is maintained when the nervous system continues to perceive safety, predictability, and reliable energy availability. Sleep quality, stress load, recovery, and routine consistency are constantly being assessed. If these inputs remain stable, fat-based fuel use remains efficient. If they drift, so does adaptation. What makes this especially deceptive is that backsliding rarely happens all at once. It is not triggered by a single poor night of sleep or one stressful week. Instead, small changes accumulate. Sleep becomes slightly shorter or more fragmented. Training intensity increases without matching recovery. Work stress rises. Meals become rushed or inconsistent. None of these changes seem significant on their own. But the nervous system does not evaluate inputs individually, it integrates them. As these signals accumulate, perceived stability decreases. Cortisol compensates more often. Glucose-based fuel becomes more appealing again. Fat oxidation is not turned off, but it is deprioritized. The body begins hedging its bets. This is how metabolic backsliding begins. Energy becomes slightly less stable. Hunger urgency increases just a bit. Stress tolerance declines. Food timing starts to feel important again. Because these changes are gradual, people often blame aging, motivation, or dietary mistakes, when the real issue is a slow erosion of the signals that once supported adaptation. Importantly, this regression does not mean fat adaptation was fake or temporary. It means it was conditional. Just like muscle mass, cardiovascular fitness, or insulin sensitivity, fat adaptation exists on a spectrum. It strengthens when conditions support it and weakens when they do not. The danger of the once adapted you're set myth is that it leads people to ignore early warning signs. By the time symptoms become obvious, fat loss stalls, cravings rise, energy crashes return. The nervous system has already shifted priorities. Understanding that fat adaptation must be maintained reframes the goal. The objective is not to achieve adaptation once, but to preserve the environment that allows it to persist. When that environment is protected, fat adaptation can remain remarkably stable. When it is neglected, no amount of dietary precision can prevent regression. This is not a failure of discipline, it is simply how adaptive biology works.
The 3 silent adaptation killers. Fat adaptation rarely breaks because of one obvious mistake. It is almost always undone quietly, through small shifts that feel manageable or even productive on the surface. These shifts do not trigger alarms. They accumulate slowly until the metabolic environment no longer supports fat-based efficiency. The 3 most common culprits are sleep erosion, stress creep, and over-optimization. Sleep erosion is the most underestimated adaptation killer. This does not mean extreme sleep deprivation. It is usually subtle and chronic, going to bed 30 to 60 minutes later than usual, waking earlier due to obligations, or sleeping lightly due to stress. Individually, these changes seem harmless, but the nervous system does not measure sleep loss dramatically. It measures it cumulatively. Over time, even mild sleep erosion reduces recovery signaling, flattens cortisol rhythms, and increases baseline stress. The body begins compensating with faster fuel strategies because long-term energy efficiency feels less reliable. Fat adaptation weakens not because sleep is bad, but because recovery no longer feels guaranteed. Stress creep works in a similar way. Life pressure rarely spikes overnight. It builds gradually. Increased work demands, family responsibilities, mental load, or emotional strain. Because this stress becomes familiar, people often normalize it. But the nervous system does not adapt by ignoring stress. It adapts by becoming more defensive. As stress creeps upward, cortisol compensates more frequently. Energy becomes slightly less stable. The body begins hedging again, relying more on glucose and stress hormones to meet demand. This happens even if diet remains unchanged. Fat adaptation fades quietly as the system prioritizes responsiveness over efficiency. The third killer is over-optimization. This one is especially deceptive because it looks like commitment. Longer fasts, tighter eating windows, harder training, more tracking, more rules. While these strategies can be useful in the right context, they become problematic when layered onto an already stressed system. Over-optimization increases cognitive and physiological load. It removes flexibility and predictability, two signals the nervous system relies on for safety. Instead of reinforcing fat adaptation, excessive control communicates instability. The body responds by tightening its grip on stored energy. What makes these three factors dangerous is that none of them feel like failure. Sleep erosion feels like adulthood. Stress creep feels normal. Over-optimization feels disciplined. But together, they recreate the same environment that blocked fat adaptation in the first place, just more quietly. Fat adaptation thrives on stability, not intensity. When sleep is protected, stress is managed, and strategy remains simple, the body continues trusting fat as fuel. When these silent killers creep in, adaptation erodes without obvious warning. Recognizing them early is the difference between protecting adaptation long-term and wondering why it slowly disappeared, even though nothing changed. The core rule: stability beats optimization. The single most important rule for protecting fat adaptation long-term is this: stability beats optimization. Fat adaptation does not persist because you constantly fine-tune, push harder, or chase better metrics. It persists because the body continues to experience a predictable, low-threat environment. When that environment remains stable, fat-based fuel use stays efficient. When it becomes erratic, even in subtle ways, adaptation begins to erode. Consistency protects adaptation better than intensity because the nervous system values reliability over performance. From a biological standpoint, the body is not trying to maximize output, it is trying to minimize risk. Intensity, frequent changes, and constant optimization introduce uncertainty. Even when those changes are well-intentioned, they force the nervous system to reassess safety repeatedly. Each reassessment increases stress signaling and pushes metabolism toward faster, more controllable fuels. Predictability, on the other hand, builds metabolic trust. When sleep timing is regular, meals are reasonably consistent, training follows a familiar rhythm, and recovery is dependable, the body learns that energy demands will be met without emergency responses. This trust allows fat oxidation to remain the preferred strategy. The nervous system relaxes its defensive posture because it no longer needs to hedge against scarcity or unpredictability.
This is why frequent protocol changes, new fasting schedules, rotating macros, variable training intensity, or constant experimentation often undermine adaptation. While variety can be useful in short bursts, chronic variability keeps the nervous system on alert. Even if caloric intake and carbohydrates remain low, the system interprets unpredictability as potential threat. Fat adaptation weakens not because the diet is wrong, but because the context feels unstable. Less effort often preserves results longer because it reduces background stress. Once fat adaptation is established, the work is largely done. The remaining task is not to improve it aggressively, but to avoid disturbing it. Gentle consistency communicates sufficiency. It allows hormonal rhythms to stabilize, recovery to complete, and fuel signaling to remain calm. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing loop where fat burning feels easy because the body is not being challenged to prove it repeatedly. This does not mean stagnation or complacency. It means intentional restraint, strategic simplicity, doing fewer things more reliably, eating in a way that feels sustainable, training in a way that supports recovery, sleeping in a way that reinforces rhythm. These signals tell the nervous system that nothing is changing and therefore nothing needs to be guarded. Optimization has its place during short, well-recovered phases, but long-term adaptation survives on boredom, not novelty, on predictability, not pressure, on stability, not intensity. When stability is protected, fat adaptation becomes resilient. When optimization becomes constant, adaptation becomes fragile. Understanding this rule is the difference between holding results for years and repeatedly having to get adapted again.
Daily non-negotiables that protect fat adaptation. Long-term fat adaptation is not protected by extreme discipline or constant optimization. It is protected by a small set of daily non-negotiables that continuously signal safety, predictability, and sufficiency to the nervous system. When these foundations are respected, fat adaptation remains stable with surprisingly little effort. When they are neglected, adaptation erodes, even if diet remains perfect. The first non-negotiable is sleep timing and recovery signaling. It is not enough to get enough sleep occasionally. The body responds most strongly to when sleep happens and how consistent it is. Regular sleep and wake times reinforce circadian rhythm, stabilize cortisol patterns, and signal that recovery is reliable. This predictability tells the nervous system that energy demands will be met without emergency responses. When sleep timing drifts, later nights, irregular schedules, fragmented rest, the body begins compensating with stress hormones and faster fuel strategies. Protecting fat adaptation requires treating sleep timing as a fixed anchor, not a flexible afterthought. The second non-negotiable is calm fueling rather than defensive restriction. Fat adaptation thrives when the body trusts that energy availability is stable. This does not mean overeating, but it does mean avoiding chronic underfueling or aggressive restriction. Skipping meals out of fear, forcing longer fasts, or constantly tightening intake communicates scarcity, even if ketones are present. Calm fueling means eating enough protein, sufficient calories, and responding to hunger signals without panic or suppression. When eating feels relaxed and predictable, the nervous system stops scanning for threat, allowing fat-based fuel use to remain dominant. The third non-negotiable is training for resilience, not stress. Exercise should reinforce adaptation, not challenge it daily. Training that is too intense, too frequent, or insufficiently recovered from becomes another stress signal layered onto the system. While occasional hard sessions are fine in a well-recovered state, chronic intensity tells the body that demands are unpredictable. Training for resilience means prioritizing recovery, maintaining consistent volume, and allowing intensity to ebb and flow rather than constantly escalate. Movement should leave the system feeling regulated, not depleted. What ties these non-negotiables together is not perfection, but reliability. The body does not require flawless execution. It requires consistent signals that nothing is changing suddenly. Sleep that happens when expected, food that arrives without anxiety, training that challenges without overwhelming. When these daily signals are protected, fat adaptation no longer feels fragile. It becomes resilient, self-reinforcing, and easy to maintain. The body continues to trust fat as fuel because nothing in the environment suggests it should stop. This is how fat adaptation is protected long-term, not through more effort, but through fewer, well-guarded foundations.
What you can relax and what you can't. One of the most freeing parts of long-term fat adaptation is realizing that not everything requires rigid control forever. Once adaptation is established and protected, certain areas can become more flexible without undoing progress. At the same time, some signals must remain consistent. Knowing the difference is critical. Relaxing the wrong variables can quietly reintroduce scarcity signals, while relaxing the right ones can actually strengthen metabolic trust. Where flexibility is safe once adapted. After fat adaptation stabilizes, the body becomes more tolerant of variation in inputs. Occasional deviations in meal timing, social meals, travel days, or slight carbohydrate fluctuations are usually well tolerated. The nervous system no longer interprets these as immediate threats because baseline energy availability feels reliable. This is metabolic flexibility in practice, the ability to adjust without destabilizing the system. Flexibility is safest when it is occasional, intentional, and temporary, not constant or reactive. Training can also become more flexible. You may tolerate harder sessions, variable schedules, or short phases of higher intensity without losing adaptation, as long as recovery remains intact. The key is that flexibility happens on top of a stable foundation, not in place of it. What still needs consistency? What cannot be relaxed is the signal layer. Sleep timing, recovery rhythms, and baseline stress load still require consistency. The body is far more sensitive to changes in sleep than changes in food. Irregular sleep, chronic late nights, or fragmented recovery quickly undermine the nervous system's sense of safety, even if diet remains perfect. Similarly, chronic underfueling cannot be masked by adaptation. Skipping meals frequently, forcing long fasts when hunger is present, or maintaining a constant calorie deficit signals scarcity. Fat adaptation survives flexibility and structure, not ongoing uncertainty in energy availability. How to avoid triggering scarcity signals. The rule is simple. Flexibility should not feel stressful. If a change creates urgency, anxiety, rigidity, or a sense of needing to make up for it, it is likely triggering scarcity signaling. Safe flexibility feels neutral, calm, recoverable. Scarcity is triggered not by change itself, but by unpredictability plus pressure. Avoid stacking stressors at the same time. Poor sleep, harder training, tighter eating, and higher life stress together. That combination tells the body it needs to hedge again. Long-term fat adaptation is not about living rigidly. It is about maintaining a stable baseline that allows flexibility without fear. Relax what does not threaten safety. Protect what does. That balance is what keeps adaptation resilient rather than fragile.
Early warning signs you're sliding back. One of the most important skills in maintaining long-term fat adaptation is recognizing early warning signs before full regression occurs. Fat adaptation rarely disappears overnight. It fades gradually through subtle changes that are easy to rationalize or ignore. Catching these signals early allows you to correct course without drastic changes. Energy volatility returning is often the first indicator. When fat adaptation is stable, energy feels even and predictable. You may still experience natural fluctuations, but they resolve quickly and do not dominate the day. As adaptation begins to erode, energy starts to feel less reliable. Morning energy may feel inconsistent. Afternoon dips return. Stimulation, caffeine, stress, urgency begins to play a larger role in maintaining function. This volatility signals that the body is relying more heavily on stress hormones and quick-access fuel again, rather than steady fat oxidation. Hunger urgency increasing is another early red flag. Hunger itself is not a problem, but the quality of hunger matters. When adaptation is intact, hunger arrives gradually and feels manageable. When metabolic trust weakens, hunger becomes louder, sharper, and more emotionally charged. Meals feel more urgent, delays feel stressful. Thoughts about food timing increase. This reflects a shift away from fuel security and back toward perceived scarcity. The body is no longer confident that energy will be available between meals. Stress tolerance shrinking often accompanies these changes. When fat adaptation is protected, stressors still exist, but they feel proportionate. Recovery happens more quickly. Emotional responses feel regulated. As adaptation erodes, the same stressors begin to feel heavier. Irritability increases. Minor disruptions feel overwhelming. Sleep may feel lighter or less restorative. This reflects rising baseline cortisol and a nervous system drifting back toward defensive mode. What makes these signs deceptive is that they often appear before obvious outcomes like weight regain or performance decline. Many people dismiss them as normal fluctuations, busy periods, or temporary stress, but these are not random. They are the nervous system signaling that stability is decreasing. Importantly, these warning signs do not mean adaptation is lost. They mean it is sliding. This is the ideal moment to intervene, not with more restriction or intensity, but by restoring the signals that supported adaptation in the first place: consistent sleep, reduced stress load, calm fueling, and predictable routines. Ignoring these early signals allows them to compound. Addressing them early preserves adaptation with minimal effort. Long-term fat adaptation is not maintained by reacting to failure. It is maintained by responding to these quiet signals before failure occurs.
How to course correct without starting over. When people notice signs that fat adaptation is slipping, the instinctive reaction is to reset. Carbohydrates are cut further, fasting windows are extended, training intensity increases, supplements are added. This response feels logical, but it is usually the wrong move. Resetting too hard reintroduces the same stress signals that caused adaptation to erode in the first place. The mistake of aggressive resetting is that it treats fat adaptation as something that must be forced back into place. In reality, fat adaptation is not lost, it is deprioritized. The body has shifted toward defensive fuel strategies because stability decreased. Adding restriction, intensity, or urgency confirms that instability. The nervous system interprets this as threat, not correction, and continues hedging energy use. The fastest way to course correct is not to tighten control, but to restore stability. This means returning to predictable sleep timing, reducing background stress, simplifying routines, and ensuring adequate energy intake. Even small improvements in sleep quality or consistency can have outsized effects. When sleep stabilizes, cortisol rhythms begin to normalize. When stress decreases, energy becomes less volatile. These shifts signal safety quickly. Calm fueling is another key lever. Rather than forcing longer fasts or ignoring hunger, eating in a relaxed, responsive way helps restore metabolic trust. This does not mean overeating or abandoning structure. It means removing fear from eating. When meals are predictable and sufficient, the nervous system stops scanning for scarcity. Fat oxidation becomes accessible again without effort. Training should also shift toward reassurance rather than challenge. Reducing volume temporarily, emphasizing recovery, and avoiding maximal intensity tells the body that demands are manageable. Movement should leave the system regulated, not depleted. Once stability returns, performance and intensity can be reintroduced gradually, without compromising adaptation. What makes this approach effective is that it works with the nervous system instead of against it. Reassurance resolves the reason adaptation slipped. Restriction and intensity only address surface variables while worsening the underlying issue. Course correcting does not require starting over. It requires removing the pressure that caused the slide. When stability is restored, fat adaptation often returns faster than it was lost because the body already knows how to use fat efficiently. You are not rebuilding from zero. You are reminding the system that it is safe again. The most important insight is this: fat adaptation responds to reassurance, not punishment. When you reduce stress, protect sleep, and simplify inputs, the system realigns naturally. No reset required.
Fat adaptation lasts when it is protected, not when it is constantly tested. The body does not maintain fat-based fuel use because you keep pushing it harder or tightening control. It maintains it because the signals that allowed adaptation to form in the first place continue to be present. Stable sleep, manageable stress, calm fueling, and predictable routines tell the nervous system that nothing has changed. When that sense of safety remains intact, fat adaptation does not feel fragile. It becomes resilient. This is the core shift most people miss. Fat adaptation is not something you hold on to through discipline. It is something that persists when the environment stays supportive. The moment stability erodes, the body adapts again, not out of failure, but out of protection. Understanding this removes a lot of unnecessary effort and self-blame. You do not need to constantly prove that fat adaptation works. You need to stop giving the body reasons to abandon it. When adaptation is protected, everything becomes easier. Energy stays reliable, hunger remains calm, stress tolerance stays high, food timing stays flexible, progress continues quietly without force. This is what long-term success actually looks like, not intensity, but durability. In the next video, we will go one step further and talk about how to build true metabolic flexibility after fat adaptation, not by undoing the work you've done, but by expanding it, so your metabolism can move smoothly between fuels without crashes, cravings, or regressions. This is where fat adaptation stops being a phase and starts becoming a foundation. If this video helped you understand why fat adaptation can slip and how to protect it, consider subscribing. This channel is focused on clear, science-based explanations that help you work with your metabolism instead of constantly fighting it.